The Sea Shall Not Have Them wasn't just Lewis Gilbert's most quietly subversive film. It was a wartime survival picture whose cast constituted the most dangerous open secret in British cinema. Two men who could have been imprisoned for who they were, standing together in the North Sea, playing heroes for an industry that would have destroyed them if the wrong person looked too closely. We are digging into the wreckage of The Sea Shall Not Have Them with 13 facts the studios kept below the waterline, facts locked inside RAF personnel records, Dirk Bogarde's methodically reconstructed private correspondence, Alan Strachan's 2004 biography of Michael Redgrave, and one devastating sentence delivered by Noel Coward in front of a Leicester Square film billboard. The Sea Shall Not Have Them is the motto of the RAF's Air Sea Rescue Service, a phrase of operational defiance coined in 1941 to articulate the service's founding commitment that no downed airman would be abandoned to the North Sea if human effort and mechanical ingenuity could retrieve him. It is, in its original context, one of the finest institutional mottos in British military history, compact, absolute, grammatically elegant, and genuinely felt by the men who flew the high-speed launches under enemy gunfire to honor it. Lewis Gilbert used it as his film's title with complete sincerity, as a tribute to a service the public had largely forgotten. What the title then did, in the hands of fate and the two men Gilbert cast as his leads, was transform into one of the most elaborately ironic sentences in the history of British cinema. The sea would not have them. The law could have. The studio would have preferred they were different men entirely. They were not. And the film that carries the motto as its name is inseparable from that fact. But the real problem was not the title. It was the billboard outside the Odeon, Leicester Square, in 1954, and the man who walked past it. Noel Coward was walking past the Odeon Cinema at Leicester Square when he saw the billboard. It read, "Michael Redgrave and Dirk Bogarde in The Sea Shall Not Have Them." Coward read it, turned to the companion beside him, and said, "I don't see why not. Everyone else has." The line is one of the most perfectly constructed sentences in the history of theatrical wit. 7 words that are simultaneously a dirty joke, a coded disclosure, a social observation, and an act of extreme recklessness. In 1954, homosexual acts between men were illegal in Britain under the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885. Coward was speaking in a public street about 2 men, one homosexual, one bisexual, whose private lives constituted criminal conduct. He said it anyway. The quip has been reprinted in every biography, every filmography, every discussion of either actor for 70 years. It is, in many respects, the most famous thing about a film that not everyone has seen. The film's actual critical reception has been largely superseded by the sentence Coward delivered in front of a poster for it. This is exactly why understanding what Redgrave and Bogarde were risking by existing on that billboard simultaneously requires understanding what Britain was in 1954. In March 1954, the same year The Sea Shall Not Have Them was filmed and released, the British government was in the grip of a moral panic about homosexuality that had been building since 1952. Lord Montague of Beaulieu had been prosecuted the previous year. The second, more successful prosecution against him, which would produce a 15-month prison sentence, was concluded in March 1954, precisely as Lewis Gilbert's cameras were rolling in Felixstowe. The Montague trial was not an isolated incident. It was a visible peak of what historians of the period have documented as a deliberate and escalating police campaign against homosexual men, a campaign that produced more than 1,000 prosecutions annually across England and Wales in the early 1950s, compared to fewer than 400 in the late 1930s. The men being prosecuted were not only the obscure. John Gielgud had been arrested in a Chelsea public lavatory in October 1953. His conviction was reported in the national press. His career survived by the thinnest margin because the public chose, barely, to separate the actor from the act. Bogarde and Redgrave were not obscure. They were on a billboard in Leicester Square. And in 1954, being on a billboard in Leicester Square while being the kind of man the law was actively hunting was an act of professional courage that the film's narrative, about men in danger, sustained by institutional commitment and individual nerve, mirrors with an irony so precise it could not have been designed. But the real problem was that Bogarde had an additional private calculation to make that Redgrave, for reasons of temperament and privilege, did not. Dirk Bogarde was the #1 box office star in Britain in 1954. His position had been built under contract to the rank organization since 1948. Sustained by a series of films, the Doctor comedies chief among them, that presented him as the supremely desirable, conspicuously heterosexual ideal of post-war British masculinity. His actual life was the opposite of everything those films implied. He was homosexual. He was living with his manager Anthony Forwood in an arrangement that everyone in the British film industry understood and nobody discussed. According to John Coldstream's biography, from the late 1950s to the mid-1970s, Bogarde subjected himself to aversion therapy once a year, a process that involved being shown erotic photographs of men and administered drugs to induce vomiting in an attempt to alter what the psychiatric establishment of his era classified as a mental illness. This is the man playing Flight Sergeant Mackay in The Dinghy. He was, at the moment of filming, the most protected and the most endangered person in British cinema simultaneously, protected by his box office power, endangered by the same laws being used to imprison men whose private lives were identical to his own. He never publicly admitted his sexuality during his lifetime. He destroyed his private papers before he died. He wrote several volumes of memoir in which homosexuality does not appear. He was Dirk Bogarde. He played the part of Dirk Bogarde. In the North Sea, in a rubber dinghy, in a film about men surviving through nerve and institutional faith, he played a different part. He played it well. He played it because it paid him. He played it because the law required him to be something other than what he was, and he was very good at that. This is exactly why the Rank organization's investment in Bogarde's heterosexual screen persona was also, in the most precise financial sense, an investment in keeping him out of prison. Michael Redgrave was Bogarde's senior by 15 years, his social superior by class and theatrical reputation, and his equal in the one biographical fact that linked them on that billboard. Redgrave was bisexual. His biography, as documented by Alan Strachan's 2004 book Secret Dreams, is one of the more extraordinary private narratives in 20th century British theatrical life. A man who told his future wife, Rachel Kempson, before their marriage that there were difficulties to do with his nature, and that he felt he ought not to marry, who then married her anyway, stayed married for 50 years, had 3 children including Vanessa, and simultaneously maintained a series of male relationships that included a long-term lover installed so close to the family home that he walked Vanessa and Lynn Redgrave to school. Redgrave's knighthood did not arrive until 1959, and biographers have since identified his reputation for sexual adventurism as a probable contributing factor in its delayed arrival. When he finally told his son Corin, decades later in the last years of his life, during the writing of his autobiography, his words were, "I am, to say the least of it, bisexual." He said it, the pause was painful, and then he asked Corin not to put it in the book. But the real problem was that both men were living these private realities at exactly the moment the film they were making was asking for their professional best. The Sea Shall Not Have Them belongs to a distinct and now largely forgotten subgenre of 1950s British cinema that existed because of one film, Charles Friend's The Cruel Sea, released in 1953 and the highest grossing film at the British box office that year. The Cruel Sea demonstrated that a war film about survival at sea, without a conventional hero's arc, without a clear villain, without a dramatic reversal or climactic land battle, a film about endurance rather than victory, could fill British cinemas to capacity with an audience still processing its wartime experience. Producer Daniel Angel and Lewis Gilbert understood the window the Cruel Sea had opened. The Sea Shall Not Have Them was not attempting to compete with the Cruel Sea. It was attempting to extend its cultural logic to a different theater of the same war. Not the Atlantic convoy routes, but the North Sea Air Sea Rescue Service, whose operations had saved 5,721 aircrew during the war and received approximately none of the public recognition given to Fighter Command, Bomber Command, or the Western Desert campaigns. The debt to the Cruel Sea is structural, the narrative patience, the procedural fidelity, the refusal to sentimentalize either the men in the water or the men trying to reach them. But the institutional subject is entirely different. Gilbert was honoring a service the country had forgotten by the time it thought to look back. But the real problem was that in trying to honor that service accurately, the film's source material introduced a complication that the screenplay had to navigate very carefully. The novel, by John Harris, published in 1953, contains a character whose sexuality is handled with the kind of oblique frankness that British fiction of the period sometimes managed better than British cinema. Aircraft man Milliken, the lowest ranked man in the dinghy, is written in a way that contemporary readers understood and film censors could theoretically challenge. Gilbert and his co-screenwriter Vernon Harris made the strategic decision to preserve Milliken as a character, his rank, his discomfort, his separateness from the masculine camaraderie of the other men, while removing any explicit textual indication of what Harris's novel had communicated. What remained on screen was a performance that contemporary letterbox reviewers, encountering the film 70 years later, found startling. One wrote with visible surprise that he couldn't believe how obvious they were making it, with his character in a film from 1954, way before the change in the law in 1967. The character Milliken, as filmed, is readable as homosexual by any contemporary viewer. In 1954, that reading could not be acknowledged in any review, any publicity material, or any official response to the film. It sat inside the finished print and said what it said to the audience members equipped to receive it. This is exactly why The Sea Shall Not Have Them is, in its quiet way, a braver film than its reputation as standard fare, Gilbert's own phrase, suggests. Lewis Gilbert had joined the Royal Air Force Film Unit when the Second World War began. Not as an aircrew member, not as a ground technician, but as a filmmaker whose entire wartime contribution was the documentation of what the RAF did and how it did it. He had been seconded to the 1st Motion Picture Unit of the U.S. Army Air Forces, where his commanding officer was the American feature director William Keeley, who allowed Gilbert to absorb professional feature filmmaking practice while nominally producing training and documentary material. Gilbert then spent years making documentary shorts for Gaumont British before moving into low-budget feature production. What this biography gave him, the specific quality that distinguishes The Sea Shall Not Have Them from every other director who might have made it, is the instinct of the documentarian operating inside a genre film. The procedural sequences in The Sea Shall Not Have Them, the high-speed launches engine problems, the radio triangulation attempts, the operational disagreements between naval and RAF commands, these have the texture of observed reality rather than dramatized exposition, because Gilbert had spent years being in rooms where operational disagreements actually happened. But the real problem was that the location where those procedures were filmed introduced a complication that Gilbert's documentary instincts alone could not resolve. The film is set in the North Sea, 20 miles off the Dutch coast in the autumn of 1944. The film was shot at Felixstowe in Suffolk, which is technically on the North Sea coast, and at Riverside Studios in Hammersmith, which is on the Thames. The open water sequences filmed off Felixstowe provided the genuine maritime environment the production needed. Actual waves, actual weather, actual horizon, actual discomfort for the cast floating in a rubber dinghy in the English autumn of 1953. The studio sequences at Riverside provided everything else. Contemporary viewers who look carefully at the interior cockpit sequences, the rescue launch's engine room, and certain dinghy close-ups will notice the transition between location authenticity and studio approximation. The light quality changes, the water movement changes, the horizon disappears. 1. TMDB reviewer observed with cheerful accuracy that much of this film appeared to have been filmed in a London Lido, while conceding that it still managed to engender quite a bit of peril. The peril is genuine, even when the North Sea is not. This is a tribute to the cast's physical commitment to conditions that were, on location, extremely cold and extremely wet, and in studio, extremely fake. This is exactly why Malcolm Arnold's score carries so much of the emotional weight that the locations could only intermittently supply. Malcolm Arnold, who composed the score for The Sea Shall Not Have Them in 1954, shot himself in the foot. This is not a metaphor. In 1944, after his brother in the RAF was killed in action, Arnold volunteered for military service. When the Army assigned him to a military band rather than a combat role, an assignment his biographers attribute to his status as principal trumpet of the London Philharmonic, he shot himself in the foot deliberately in order to be invalided out and returned to civilian musical life. The act produced the outcome he intended. He returned to the LPO, then left it permanently in 1948 to compose full-time. By 1954, he was at the absolute peak of his productivity. In the same year as The Sea Shall Not Have Them, he also scored Hobson's Choice for David Lean and The Bells of St. Trinian's for Frank Launder, managing a compositional output that most serious film composers would find physically impossible. The score for The Sea Shall Not Have Them uses sparse orchestral forces with a precision that amplifies the film's procedural restraint. The music never tells the audience what to feel about the men in the dinghy when the images are already making that argument. 3 years later, Arnold would write The Bridge on the River Kwai, win the Academy Award, and become the most celebrated British film composer of his generation. In 1954, he was simply the best available option for a modestly budgeted survival picture, and he was not available very long. But the real problem was not the film's score, it was the film's survival, in an entirely literal sense. In the 1990s, the National Film Theatre in London planned to screen The Sea Shall Not Have Them as part of a Lewis Gilbert retrospective season. The NFT contacted the relevant archive and rights holders to arrange the necessary film print. The screening had to be cancelled when the NFT discovered that no cinema prints of the film were known to exist. A film released in 1954 to solid British box office, distributed internationally by United Artists, reviewed by Variety as having several basic ingredients of a box office success, that film had lost its prints within 40 years of release. The Sea Shall Not Have Them exists today in a form accessible to general audiences, largely because of the transfer of surviving materials to home video formats and subsequently to digital streaming through services including the Criterion Channel, which included it in a Dirk Bogarde collection. The NFT cancellation is a footnote in the film's reception history. It is also a precise measure of how completely a commercially successful British film could disappear in the late 20th century when nobody was actively protecting it. This is exactly why the film that Noel Coward made famous with one sentence in front of a billboard is now seen primarily on a streaming platform by viewers who encounter it through a Dirk Bogarde retrospective, on their own terms, at their own pace, in a world that has changed more than anyone standing in Leicester Square in 1954 could have predicted. Variety's review identified the film's commercial logic with precision, tough but believable plot, a cast too big for the average theater marquee, and exciting action sequences in the climax. The praise is genuine but revealing. It describes a film that works as a commercial product rather than as an artistic achievement, which is how the British film trade press tended to approach the modest survival pictures of the period. Gilbert himself, in his later accounts, described The Sea Shall Not Have Them as standard fare that did very well. A characterization so self-deprecating that it erases everything interesting about the film in a single subordinate clause. American critical and commercial reception was weaker. The film underperformed in a market saturated with war pictures where British production values were often perceived as insufficiently spectacular. The reviews that did appear treated it as a competent entry in a crowded field, which is what it was if you read only what was on the surface and missed everything that was underneath it. The Criterion Channel included The Sea Shall Not Have Them in its Dirk Bogarde collection, which positioned the film for contemporary audiences who came to it through a serious actor rather than a genre. Audiences equipped to recognize what the film contains that the original 1954 critical conversation could not name. Letterboxd users have written reviews that identify the Milliken character, the biographical realities of the two leads, the specific courage of making this film with these men in this legal climate, with a directness that no 1954 publication could have managed. The film's critical score on the platform reflects an audience that has learned to read the film's silences as content rather than omission. Gilbert's career, which stretched from this film to Alfie to 3 James Bond pictures to Educating Rita to Shirley Valentine, a span of creative range that the BFI identified as making him the most prolific British director then living, is now understood as having begun in earnest in Felixstowe in 1954. The Sea Shall Not Have Them was not where Gilbert peaked. It was where he proved he could do it. The film that survived production is not primarily about survival in the North Sea. It is about the performance of identity under institutional pressure, the performance of the brave airman, the reliable sergeant, the committed rescue officer by men whose private identities the institution would not have tolerated and the law actively criminalized. Redgrave and Bogarde did not discuss this between takes. They did not need to. They were both fluent in the grammar of performing what was required while being something different underneath. The film they made is, in that specific sense, a genuinely autobiographical work. Not in its plot, but in its condition. Every scene in which a man must hold his nerve while the institution around him does not know what he actually is had a performer on screen who understood that condition from the inside. The question, The Sea Shall Not Have Them, embeds in its closing frames. In the relief of rescue, in the institutional machinery that saved men it would have imprisoned if it had known them better, is this. If a film about survival and institutional loyalty was made by 2 men who survived by keeping their real selves invisible to the very institutions the film was honoring, what does that tell you about which men the British state was actually trying to protect? And which men it was simply prepared to use when it needed something done, and punish when it didn't? Leave that in the comments. The Sea Shall Not Have Them. The law had other arrangements. If this investigation changed how you see The Sea Shall Not Have Them, Leave a like because there are 1,000 films with buried truths that deserve the same forensic attention, and the algorithm needs to know this kind of digging matters.